Why do so many autistic people have difficulties with eating? Come join me on the rabbit hole of what is going on with taste, smell, and texture perception in autistic people. This is a break from your regularly scheduled drug programming from me because a student asked me a question in class and I was curious. Side note, I will be using identity first language throughout this video because it appears, according to the latest research, that it is preferred by the autistic community. So 90% of autistic people report some sort of sensitivity related to their senses. So this can be things like it's too loud, or this texture is too itchy, or everything is too bright. In most cases, we see hypersensitivity, so people are more sensitive to the senses around you, but sometimes it can be less sensitive as well. And this can be linked to some of the food sensitivity issues too. So we see that autistic people typically are more selective around their food. So they're considered picky eaters because they don't like to eat a variety of different foods. On average, autistic children had fewer than 20 foods in their kind of standard foods that they're willing to eat. This happens a lot for a long period of time. About 70 to 80% of autistic children had food selectivity issues for more than 2 years. And this can lead to things like nutritional inadequacies, which is also a great band name and a big problem. So autistic children might not be able to kind of meet all of their nutrient needs. On average, we see that this might lead to things like GI distress and sometimes even obesity, although there are other contributing factors to that too. So why is this? And it seems like there are a whole bunch of different problems that are all showing up in eating related behaviors. So eating is actually a very complex behavior. It involves kind of those hunger signals, which is what I'm not talking about in this section, but it also involves things like taste and smell and texture. So let's start with texture. It seems like autistic children in particular are way more sensitive to things like texture. This is listed as one of the primary reasons why kids were unwilling to actually eat different types of food. The texture was bad. Now, weirdly, even though it's listed as one of the main things, we haven't actually done a lot of research as to whether there's a texture sensitivity. So are there tongues actually more sensitive to texture? Is it a perception in the brain? What is actually going on here? We don't have that research, but it is still listed as the #1 reason when asked on things like questionnaires. So autistic people were actually likely to say that they were refusing a food for texture's sake, but then they also listed a variety of other reasons, like it was mixed together with something else. It was the wrong brand. The shape was wrong. And then the second most common reason was that the taste or smell were off. And this leads me to the next and biggest rabbit hole, and that is our sense of taste and smell in autism. So oversensitivity to things like taste and smell has actually been proposed as a biomarker for autism. Maybe this is a way that we can actually kind of determine if somebody is autistic or not. Let's start with taste. What we see is that on average, 36 to 72% of autistic people said that they were overly sensitive to taste. And this can be things like they just had a more negative reaction to certain tastes, but also that they were just more sensitive to taste in general. And there are some studies that say that autistic people actually have trouble identifying different types of food, but not necessarily detecting them or if they like them. Now, don't ask me to explain the difference between detecting and identifying. I started to look into this and then realized that A, I'm tired, and B, I don't really care because it involves psychophysics and I hate physics. So if you want me to, I can look into it more, but please don't make me. And there's another study that said that people who had higher levels of autistic linked eating behaviors, so problems with restrictive eating, they were also more likely to be more sensitive to the taste of food, the texture of food, and also the aftertaste of food. Now, there was a huge problem with this study, and that was terrible. The study is just genuinely horrific. So they just did a self-report questionnaire of 100 different people, only a small percentage of which actually had autism, and then basically linked these results and people with both autism and who didn't have it and said oh yeah, here's the small percentage of people and here's this correlation. So let's move on to better research. There's actually some really good neuroscience on this. So for example, there's a study looking at the EN2 gene, which is linked to kind of sensitivity to bitter taste. So bitter is seen in a lot of things like coffee and dark chocolate and things like kale. And what we see is that the EN2 gene is linked to bitter sensitivity, so you're more sensitive to bitter taste, and it's also linked to autism spectrum disorder. And we also see that there are other types of hormones that might be linked to these things too. So we know that the arginine vasopressin hormone is linked to autism spectrum disorder, and it also seems to be linked to taste sensitivity. And specifically, it's linked to things like the social behavior differences that you commonly see in autism spectrum disorder. It's not just taste. We also see this for things like smell too. So a lot of autistic people will rate certain pleasant scents as actually more unpleasant. So cinnamon, clove, and pineapple. A lot of people say that those are like good smells, and a lot of autistic people will say that those are negative smells. Like they just don't like them at all. And there like seems to just be differences in kind of smell impairments in general. And this is not just true for human models, you see this in the animal models too. So like the rat and mouse models of autism, you actually see that they might have an impaired olfactory system. The olfactory system is what is linked to your ability to smell, and we actually see that there might be like changes or differences in the olfactory bulb in people with autism spectrum disorder. We see those in the animal models. You also see like impaired smell in Drosophila models too, which might be a jump scare for any of you who took genetics. But those fruit fly models, yeah, they have impaired scent differences too in the model of autism. So a lot of autistic people will say that they actually avoid certain foods because of the odors of them. Now, intriguingly here, that difference in the sense of smell seems to go away in autistic adults. So there's something here between autistic children and autistic adults, and I don't know if it's like a developmental difference, if there's some sort of like weird diagnosis here. We're not entirely sure. And intriguingly enough, your sense of taste and smell, those differences can be linked to things like the sleep disturbances that you commonly see in autistic people too. So, what is leading autistic people to kind of avoid certain foods? It seems like it might be texture, but we don't have the good like neuroscience on that yet. It definitely seems to be linked to things like taste and smell. The correct answer to why autistic people have eating related difficulties are all sorts of things, a lot of them including our senses.